So when you think about New Zealand and Australia, in a pure, if there is such a thing as a pure social insurance system, what you do is the benefit system maintains people's status. You know, it sort of gives them a fixed proportion of their income when they retire or when they become disabled or when they become unemployed. To a very large extent, what you get out is what you put in. These make these systems more expensive, so they spend more money on social security, and there's a tendency for people to think that more expensive is more generous. But basically, a lot of that spending is generosity to the middle classes and the well-off. So I would argue that universal and income-tested schemes to varying degrees are actually more likely to be more generous to the lifetime poor and those who have not contributed to social insurance systems, particularly young people, women and migrants. However, in a lot of the debate about the design of welfare states, one of the central issues is that if you have a broader and more universal welfare state, they provide higher levels of benefits to the poor because actually they're bringing the middle class into the system. And so there's a debate, which I'm sure you've had here as well, about whether the sort of targeting we have in New Zealand and Australia does that undercut political support for generosity to the poor. People like Bob can correct me on this, but I'm going to make some rather broad observations about incentives. And this is both incentives to work and incentives to save, and also to a certain extent incentives about household formation. Now, different forms of assistance and financing have different implications for incentives. Contributory systems may actually enhance incentives to participate in the labour market. For example, there's analysis of paid maternity or parental leave shows that the right to return to work promotes labour force attachment amongst young women, but if the parental leave gets over a certain period of time, that can actually then work in the opposite direction. So that in the literature on maternity and parental leave, the argument would be relatively short but generous payments will keep people attached to the labour force. There's also, and get them into the labour force, more likely to get them into the labour force in the first instance. Also, in a lot of the debate about pension systems, there's work being done by Richard Disney, a UK economist, which argues that, particularly for women, more pension systems that are more related to your contributions actually encourage participation in the labour force because there's an additional benefit from being in the labour force. And similarly, childcare support, whether you provide it through services or through vouchers or cash payments, can also encourage employment, particularly if it's targeted to people who are employed or those looking for work. On the other hand, benefits have what are called an income effect, i.e., they can substitute. Well, I shouldn't use that word. They provide support for people which may lead them to reduce their work effort or savings effort. So universal payments like family allowances may have this income effect, but it'll be small because they're generally not very large payments. But more generous income-tested payments for low-income families, which are income-tested on both the earnings of partners, are likely to have stronger work disincentives. If you have family-based taxation, for example, there's considerable literature arguing that that discourages the employment of second earners. I make the observation that virtually all OECD countries actually have income-tested payments for low-income families, which actually make the effect of the tax unit largely irrelevant for most low-income families. And obviously there's a big debate about support for the non-employed and whether that acts as a disincentive to work. My observation here would be that generosity needs not only to take account of the level of benefits, but it also needs to take account of the ease of access and the potential duration of benefits. And basically, the specific eligibility conditions are very important. So say, for example, you can argue from the literature that a contributory social insurance system does encourage people into the labour force, but then if you have sort of very generous early retirement provisions, that will let people get out of the labour force. And in fact, the evidence tends to be that most of the difference in employment patterns across OECD countries is actually amongst people under 25 and people over 55. That between the ages of about 25 and 55, France has as high an employment rate as the United States, or the United States did before the global financial crisis. Also, I'd argue that expectations built into society and into the benefit system are likely to be important. Now, just thinking about the types of redistribution, I mean, there are 2 or 3 types of redistribution that are possible in benefit systems. And what Australia, and the major distinctions are between redistribution between rich and poor, also known as the Robin Hood motive, to take from the rich to give to the poor, or across the life cycle. And Nicholas Barr, an economist at the London School of Economics, calls this the piggy bank motive. So basically, welfare states provide risk insurance against unemployment, disability or sickness, and they provide the equivalent of savings for retirement. Now, in fact, all welfare states are a mix of these two, but the mix of emphasis varies. There are other very important types of redistribution. I mean, the welfare state does redistribute a lot between men and women. That's usually not an explicit objective, but it's a consequence of the way welfare states are designed. Now, part of the problem is when you make comparisons across countries and you use this sort of point-in-time snapshot, basically what you are measuring it as if all of the redistribution was between rich and poor. Now, I'd argue, and I'm not going to go into great detail, is that when you look at studies that look at redistribution across people's lifetimes, and you have to model this obviously, basically they find that the level of redistribution between rich and poor is less than it appears at a point in time, but it's still very strongly associated with the progressivity of the benefit structure. And I think in thinking about the effects of welfare systems, it's important to think of a number of issues such as the difference between targeting, between progressivity and redistribution. In New Zealand and Australia, we have targeted systems. Targeting is both in terms of the entitlement. We choose groups to provide benefits to. We don't give benefits to everybody just on the basis of low income, but you have to fulfil a category. And then we income and asset test some of those payments. Now, progressivity is a broader concept. It refers to the profile of the benefit system when compared to market or disposable incomes. And redistribution is the outcome of that. Redistribution in these comparisons is a product of 2 things, which is how much do you spend and how targeted it is to different income groups. But really but that's a process. Really what we're interested in is the outcomes. I mean, how effective is the system in terms of promoting income equality or reducing inequality and reducing poverty. Now, I'll go briefly through this. I mean, New Zealand and Australia differ from, as I said, from most other OECD countries. Monica referred to these figures. In 2005, what the OECD define as social spending in New Zealand was about 90% of the OECD average. That's all the cash benefits to people of working age and retirement age, public healthcare spending and all the services, childcare, disability services, aged person services. So New Zealand was about 90% of the OECD average and spent 18.5% of GDP on these things. Australia was a bit less. It spent 17% of GDP. But in New Zealand, you tax benefits much more highly than Australia does. So the direct taxation paid by benefit recipients is a bit higher than average. And indirect taxation is a bit lower than the OECD average. Whereas in Australia, the direct taxes on benefits are about the lowest in the OECD. And indirect taxes, although they increased quite significantly, are still well below the OECD average.